The crack of the bat had barely faded when it happened. Not a hit. Not a swing and miss. Something nobody on that practice field had ever seen before, and something nobody who was there will ever forget. Shohei Ohtani threw his bat. Not carelessly. Not accidentally. He threw it, with intention, with force, with the kind of controlled fury that stops an entire practice session dead in its tracks. Every member of Samurai Japan froze. Coaches, players, support staff, all of them watching the same thing and struggling to process what their eyes were telling them. Because this was Shohei Ohtani. The man whose composure is as legendary as his fastball. The man who had stood in the final at-bat of a World Baseball Classic championship game, facing his own idol, and shown nothing on his face except focus. The man whose emotional baseline during competition makes other elite athletes look theatrical by comparison. That man had just thrown his bat in front of the entire squad. And then he shouted. The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone heard in Miami that day. But the bat throw was only the beginning. Because in the minutes and hours after that moment, in the chaotic, charged atmosphere of a team suddenly confronting something it hadn't prepared for, two more things happened that nobody expected. Teruaki Sato and Yukio Shida walked over to where Ohtani stood. They picked up his elbow pad. And they said something that made every person watching hold their breath. And then Kensuke Kondo, the veteran, the respected cornerstone of the squad, the man who had always been one of the calmest voices in the program, walked directly to Ohtani, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm sorry for saying that to Shohei." What had been said? What had happened in the minutes before the bat left Ohtani's hand? And what did those words from Kondo mean, not just for the two men standing face to face on a practice field in Miami, but for the entire identity of Samurai Japan going forward? The answers, when they finally surfaced, revealed a side of Ohtani that the world had never been given access to before. The Samurai Japan squad arrived in Miami carrying something heavier than luggage. The build-up to this training camp had been unusually charged. Within the program, tensions that had been quietly accumulating through the domestic season had followed the players across the Pacific. The expectations surrounding this iteration of the national team were enormous, perhaps unfairly so. The 2023 WBC championship had set a standard that now functioned less as inspiration and more as pressure. Every practice session, every internal conversation, every moment of friction between players happened in the shadow of what this team had already achieved and what the world expected it to achieve again. Miami was supposed to be a reset. A chance to establish rhythm away from the domestic pressures of NPB, away from the familiar environments that sometimes made it harder for players to shift mentally into national team mode. The warm weather, the professional facilities, the physical distance from Japan, all of it was designed to create the conditions for focus. Instead, within days of arrival, the conditions created something else entirely. The practice session that would become famous started unremarkably. Batting rotations, fielding work, pitching drills running in parallel across different sections of the complex. The kind of structured, professional preparation that Ibata's staff had carefully designed and that the players had been executing with the mechanical reliability of men who understood what was at stake. And then something happened near the batting cage. Something was said. Directed at Ohtani, in earshot of the squad, at a volume and with a specificity that could not be mistaken for casual conversation. Those who heard it described it afterward in careful language, the language of people who understood that what they had witnessed was significant and who were choosing their words with appropriate seriousness. The comment, they said, touched on something deeply personal. Not his performance. Not his technique. Something about who he was and how he was perceived within the team dynamic. Ohtani heard it. He turned. He looked at the source of the words. And then, in one single motion that took less than 2 seconds and will be discussed for years, he threw his bat and shouted. Before going further, it is important to be precise about something. Ohtani throwing his bat was not a tantrum. It was not the impulsive reaction of a player who had momentarily lost control of his emotions and would later be embarrassed by what he had done. Anyone who interpreted it that way was misreading both the moment and the man. People who have spent real time around Ohtani, teammates, coaches, people who have observed him across years of professional baseball at the highest levels, describe his emotional expression in very specific terms. He does not leak. He does not gradually show frustration through small signals that build until something eventually gives way. His composure is genuine, not performed, which means that when something finally breaks through it, the expression is equally genuine. The bat throw was a statement. It was Ohtani communicating, in the clearest and most unambiguous language available to him in that moment, that a line had been crossed. That whatever had been said to him was not something he would absorb quietly and process privately and address diplomatically at a later time. It was something that needed to be addressed right now, in front of everyone, because the entire squad needed to understand that this was not acceptable. Former teammates who heard about the incident immediately understood. One Nippon Ham player who spent years alongside Ohtani during his development years described it this way: when Ohtani reacts visibly, stop everything and pay attention. Because it means something has reached a threshold that his normal processing cannot contain. And whatever that thing is, it matters. The squad on that Miami practice field stopped everything. And they paid attention. What happened next is the detail that has traveled furthest through the baseball world since that day in Miami. Teruaki Sato and Yukio Shudo were standing nearby when Ohtani's bat hit the ground. Both players, Sato the explosive young outfielder whose talent had made him one of the most watched players in the program, Shudo the technically precise infielder whose quiet professionalism had made him a trusted figure in the squad, moved at almost the same moment. They walked to where Ohtani's equipment had landed. They picked up his elbow pad, which had come loose during the moment of release. And they held it, not handing it back immediately, but holding it, standing with it, as they spoke. What they said has been described by witnesses in terms that carry the weight of something rehearsed not in language but in character. Sato and Shudo, according to those present, told Ohtani directly that what had been said to him was wrong. That it did not reflect how the team saw him. That the standard he had set, the daily, unrelenting, private standard that had no audience and required no recognition, was the reason all of them were standing on a practice field in Miami representing their country. They said it simply. Without performance. Holding his elbow pad like a small, physical act of loyalty. The image of it, two players, standing with their teammates' equipment, making a declaration about who they were and what they stood for, is the kind of moment that defines a team culture in ways that no speech from a manager ever can. It was Sato and Shudo saying, without ambiguity, "We see you. We know what you are. And we are on your side." Ohtani looked at them for a long moment. Then he nodded. Of everything that happened on that practice field in Miami, Kensuke Kondo's apology is the most complex and the most revealing. Kondo is not a young player finding his footing in an unfamiliar environment. He is a veteran. A player whose career has been defined by steadiness, by professionalism, by the kind of consistent quality that earns genuine respect from teammates rather than simply the deference that talent commands. When Kondo speaks inside a Samurai Japan setting, people listen, not because of his statistics but because of who he is. Which makes the fact that he was the one who had said something to Ohtani both surprising and, on reflection, deeply understandable. The details of what Kondo said, the specific words that preceded the bat throw, have not been fully disclosed publicly. What has been communicated, through the accounts of those present and through Kondo's own subsequent words, is that it was something said in frustration. Something that emerged from the accumulated tension of a training camp that had been more difficult than expected. Something that, in the moment of saying it, Kondo may not have fully weighed. But it landed on Ohtani with full force. And Kondo, to his enormous credit, understood that immediately. The walk across the practice field that Kondo made after the bat throw, the deliberate, unhurried walk of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it, is something that several players described as one of the most significant things they witnessed during the entire Miami camp. Not because apologies are rare in team sports, but because of the quality of that particular apology. Kondo did not qualify it. He did not soften it with context or explanation. He stood in front of Ohtani, in front of the entire assembled squad, and said the words directly, "I'm sorry for saying that to Shohei." 7 words. No deflection. No self-protection. Just accountability, offered cleanly and completely. Those who witnessed the exchange between Kondo and Ohtani in the moments following the apology describe Ohtani's response in terms that have stayed with them. He did not perform forgiveness. He did not make a gesture designed for the audience of teammates watching. He did not say something generous and quotable that would make everyone feel resolved and comfortable. He was quiet for a moment. And then he spoke to Kondo in a way that everyone present described as private, not a whisper, but the register of a man talking to another man rather than to a room. What he said has not been shared publicly in full. What witnesses have communicated is the quality of it, that it was honest, that it was direct, and that it treated Kondo as a person deserving of a real response rather than a managed one. Afterward, players who had been standing nearby said that the atmosphere on the practice field changed. Not dramatically. Not with any single visible moment of release. But something shifted, the way pressure shifts when a valve finally opens. The weight that had been sitting over the squad since the tensions began to accumulate seemed, in the space of that exchange, to lighten. Practice resumed. Players returned to their stations. The session continued. But it continued differently. With a clarity that had not been there before. With the kind of collective focus that only becomes possible after something unresolved has finally been resolved. Step back from the specific details, the bat, the elbow pad, the apology, and look at what the Miami practice session actually demonstrated about this team. It demonstrated that the standards Ohtani represents are not abstract. They are not ceremonial. They are not the kind of standards that get celebrated in press conferences and then quietly set aside when the reality of competition and fatigue and human friction makes them inconvenient. They are real standards. Standards with edges. Standards that, when violated, produce real consequences, not imposed from above by management or enforced through formal disciplinary processes, but felt immediately and personally by the people in the room. Ohtani throwing his bat was not a loss of control. It was a standard defending itself. Sato and Shudo picking up the elbow pad was not a staged gesture of support. It was 2 players making a choice about who they wanted to be and whose values they wanted to align themselves with. Kondo's apology was not reputation management. It was a man recognizing that he had failed a standard he himself believed in, and choosing accountability over comfort. And all of it, every piece of it, happened without a manager calling a meeting. Without an organizational intervention. Without a formal process being activated. It happened because the culture was real enough to self-correct. That is the thing about environments where genuine standards exist, they do not require constant enforcement from the top. They require enough people who have internalized the values so deeply that when something violates those values, the response is immediate and human and honest. Miami showed that Samurai Japan had that. Not perfectly. Not without friction. But genuinely. In the days following the practice session, the Miami camp found its rhythm. Ibata, in his morning briefings, made no public reference to what had happened. He did not need to. The players who had been there carried the memory of it into every subsequent session, not as a source of lingering tension, but as a reference point. A shared experience that had tested the team and produced something valuable in the testing. Kondo returned to his role with a quality that several teammates described as renewed. Not chastened into smallness, but sharpened. The accountability he had shown on that practice field had, if anything, elevated his standing among the squad, because the players who had watched him walk across that field and say those 7 words understood what it cost him to do it. They respected it. Sato and Shudo, already respected within the group, had demonstrated something through the elbow pad moment that would define how their teammates saw them for the rest of the program. They had chosen a side when it mattered. Not the side of convenience or politics or self-protection, the side of what was right. And Ohtani returned, as he always returns, to his routine. Early arrivals. Meticulous preparation. The controlled consumption of exactly what his body needed. The quiet, complete professionalism that had always been his primary form of communication with the people around him. But the players who had witnessed the bat throw and everything that followed saw the routine differently now. They had seen, in one unguarded moment, what lived beneath the composure. The fire that the routine contained. The depth of investment that the calm surface concealed. And knowing that, truly knowing it, having witnessed it, changed how they approached their own preparation. Not because Ohtani had demanded it, but because seeing what genuine investment actually looks like, in its undisguised form, makes it very difficult to accept anything less from yourself. Somewhere in the record books, the Miami training camp will be noted as a period of preparation before international competition. Dates, drills, outcomes. The administrative language of organized sport. But for the players who were on that practice field on the day Ohtani threw his bat, the record that matters will never appear in any official document. It will live in the memory of what they saw. A great man reaching his limit. Two teammates choosing loyalty over comfort. A veteran finding the courage to say 7 words without flinching. And then, practice resuming. The work continuing. The standard holding. Baseball, at its most essential, is not played on the field. It is built in moments like these. In the friction and the accountability and the human choices that happen when the cameras are somewhere else and the only audience is the people who will carry those moments for the rest of their lives. Miami gave Samurai Japan something that no training drill could manufacture. It gave them a story about who they were. And it gave them a reason to become worthy of it. And Shodo's gesture changed the team forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we want to hear from you.